almost nobody on YouTube was right about link summoning, and I'm including myself in that demographic. No, really. I'm going to make a video about it later on this summer when we've actually had a full year of link summoning, but pretty much every single prediction made by a YouTuber was wrong. It was wrong for a lot of reasons, and the biggest two were that we didn't have enough link monsters to actually look at to determine what the metagame was going to look like, and also we could never have predicted a lot of the forbidden and limited list changes that eventually happened over the past 6 months or so. We've had a lot of really crazy forbidden limited lists that are pretty unprecedented in Yu-Gi-Oh! Outside of 2013 and a couple lists prior to that year. So link summoning as a whole was way different than people anticipated, and it actually turned out way better than I think most people thought it would. I'm not going to say that it slowed down the game. I know a lot of people thought that's what it was supposed to do, that's what it was meant to do. I don't think that was ever really the intention, and I think we can just kind of look at the design of Link monsters and see that they're the most generic extra deck type. They're basically synchros without the tuners. That's actually how I explain it to returning players, and that's a pretty straightforward explanation of them, and it kind of goes to show that if synchro monsters sped up the game a lot, when you make a less restricted version of them, of course they're not going to slow down the game at all. And I think that in general the game hasn't sped up or slowed down too much. I think it's about the same as it was a year ago, which is pretty weird. But also, we're currently in one of the most diverse formats that we've seen since 2014. There are like 10 different decks that are viable at a very competitive level, and even more beyond that at like a regional level, which is crazy. I think this format is awesome. Even the arguably best deck, well, it's really not arguably the best deck, but even Pendulum Editions aren't that overpowering, and I think the fact that pendulums are sort of the best deck by default in a format where link summons are out is pretty crazy in and of itself, because a lot of people thought that link summoning was going to ruin pendulums entirely. But anyway, that's not really what this video is about. I just kind of wanted to give you a quick introduction as to what's going on. This video is going to be about what decks actually were killed by link summoning, and I don't think it's ones that you have expected, because these are not the ones that anyone talked about when link summoning was announced. But it turns out that in a format as wide open as this one, there are still decks that cannot compete because of link summoning. However, these ones are kind of peculiar because they're all sort of the same thing except slightly different. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the types of decks that play pendulum monsters and a lot of back row. That's pretty straightforward, but that's really the three decks that I'm going to talk about today. That's what they all have in common. So the decks that play a lot of pendulum monsters and also want a lot of back row, like 5 pieces of back row, are the worst decks in link format. It's not decks that I thought were going to be bad, like the ones that wanted to summon from the extra deck, because I was thinking too simple-mindedly. I was just thinking, oh, you can't play as many extra deck monsters without link summoning first, so decks that want to summon from the extra deck a lot are going to be in a weird spot. But actually, the most impactful change on a lot of like worse off decks was the change of the pendulum markers. Now, Konami absolutely had to change the pendulum markers. I'm not even going to debate that, because if they didn't change them, then you would have a ton of extra zones on the mat. Not only would you have to keep track of the zones for the actual link monsters and the extra zones, but also the 5 monster zones and the 5 spawn trap card zones, and then also the pendulum zones on the left and right. That would have been way too crazy, so they put them in the regular back row, which I think is really how they should have been from the beginning. But anyway, there are 3 decks in particular that really want both of their pendulum zones taken up and also 5 back row, and none of those decks can be competitive really anymore. None of them have been competitive, at least, and I think this is the main reason why. So the first one is Cliff Forts. Now, Cliff Forts have slowly been getting unbanned. We just got Towers back on the last list, so people have kind of been wanting to play them, and even after that last ban list, their price kind of rose just for a couple days, but we have not seen them in any tournaments. I don't think there's a single Cliff Fort top since link summoning, at least in the TCG, and I definitely know Towers Turbos decks have actually came out, and Cliff Forts are probably the original pendulum deck that played a lot of back row, because, and I'm going to make a video about this. See, this whole video is just foreshadowing future videos, but when pendulums came out, they really weren't impactful outside of Clifforts, and Clifforts are barely pendulums. I mean, yes, they are pendulum monsters, I completely understand that, but they're like so bad at actually utilizing what makes the pendulum summoning mechanic good that it's kind of hilarious that that was like the first big pendulum deck, because really it was just a stun deck that had one extra back row spot because you didn't have to place Cliffort Scout. If Cliffort Scout was like a continuous spell, the whole deck would have been almost the same as it was, but luckily it was in the pendulum zone, so you could place another piece of back row. But really the Cliffort monsters are just sort of like stun monsters. They're not so much like pendulums that we now think of them. They're not really like magicians or metal foes or even the Pepe deck, nothing like that. They're more of just a stun deck with big monsters that happen to be pendulums. Anyway, Clifforts are so bad off right now. So yes, you always pretty much have to have Scout up, so that's one pendulum zone. And then you likely want the other pendulum zone taken up as well. So then you have 2 spots taken, 3 back row. One of them has to go to Sacrifice. That only leaves 2 back row spots for your stun cards. Now, never mind the fact that Vanity's Emptiness is banned and Skill Drain is limited, which were the 2 most common stun cards played in Cliffort decks. Even beyond that, there are still good stun cards out there, like Lose One Turn's fairly decent, but even with that, those 2 spots aren't enough when you consider that one of those spots you really want to have open for activating cards like Pot of Desires or Pot of Duality, or, and this is really ruined, Card of Demise, because the whole point of Card of Demise in Cliffort when that card came out was that you could Card of Demise after placing 2 cards in Pendulum Scales, and then you drew all back rows so you could set them. But that's really, really difficult now that you can't place all the cards that you draw, and a lot of the times you're just sort of going to blank the Card of Demise and end up discarding cards, which is obviously not very good, because at that point it's just a worse Pot of Desires. So Clifforts are the first one. I think another one is Dynamis. Many people might not think Dynamis ever had a chance of being competitive, but they actually came really, really close to topping a couple tournaments when Maximum Crisis came out because of Dynamist Howling. This card is like ridiculous. Dynamist kind of remind me of FAs, where they have a lot of really good spells and traps, but maybe the monsters are kind of lacking. But yeah, so Dynamist Howling is ridiculous. Dynamist Charge is good as well. Dynamists just have a lot of really good back row cards, and they're very similar to Clifforts in that way. And also Dynamists, I mean, I would even argue, are more of a pendulum deck than Clifforts, because the pendulum skills that Dynamists have actually did something. It was actually pretty tough to get over when Dynamists could set up a field with like Howling and then 2 pendulum skills. They were really hard to kill because the pendulum skills like protect their monsters. It's just really tough. You had to have like a lot of pieces of back row destruction, and yeah, so Dynamists actually almost topped a YCS when they got Dynamist Howling, which is kind of unsurprising when you actually take the time to read the cards, but this deck pretty much fell from grace as soon as Lynx got released. Even with Mistar Boy, this deck just has no chance of being competitive ever again. Even if it really didn't have a huge chance of it earlier, now it definitely doesn't without a dedicated Dynamist Link monster. And Cliffort Genius doesn't fix either of these 2 decks that I've mentioned, even though technically you can make it, because the big difference here and what I'm trying to tell you guys is that the pendulum zones themselves, the hindrance that those now provide or restrict you with, is the real problem with these decks. It's not so much about the extra deck summons at all. It's just about where the pendulum zones are located. But one of the most recent ones that I think surprised a lot of people is Counter Fairies. This deck just got a structure deck, and it was pretty hyped, and I mean it really was, and we just got Solemn Judgment back, and we have all these tools to make Counter Fairies good. And yeah, Counter Fairies sort of always have had the problem where if they don't draw like their fairy monsters and counter traps in a really good balanced ratio, they're kind of screwed, and also they're really terrible going second. But all things considered, no matter what, like Counter Fairies are actually worse off now with all of their recent support than they ever have been. I mean, back in like old school Yu-Gi-Oh, Bountiful Artemis was actually just like good enough to like win games. And then if we look at when Card of Demise came out, very similar to like with Clifforts, when Card of Demise first came out, it was actually very successful in some rogue Counter Fairy decks just because of the exact same thing with Clifforts. You would place your pendulum stuff in the pendulum scales, you draw a bunch of cards, you set a bunch of back row, and that was pretty good. But now we go here and we have a new structure deck that gives a ton of really fantastic support to this deck, and you would think that Counter Fairies are in the best position they've ever been in, and yet we haven't seen them pop up in any tournaments. I mean, I'm actually super surprised at how few Counter Fairies like made an impact. You would think at like the very first weekend that they were around, someone would have got like a regional top with them, but I don't even think a single regional top happened, which is pretty disappointing. But once again, it's because they're taking up one of those back row slots for their dedicated pendulum monster that they have to have in the pendulum zone, and that really restricts them on what they can do with card demise and how many pieces of back row they can set. But anyway, that is going to pretty much wrap up this video. Hopefully you guys knew this discussion. I think it's interesting. I really do. I think it's cool how like not many decks were actually negatively affected by link summoning, and I think that is in part a lot to how good the link monsters actually ended up being. When they first came out, I just kind of complained about how like Decode Talker is just really abysmal compared to like other like synchros and exceed monsters when they first came out, and even like Mrs. Radiant was like the best link monster for a while just because it had the best markers and the easiest summoning condition. But I think they've really been well rounded as we've gotten more and more link monsters, which is really cool. So I can't wait to see I guess, and then after the next set and after we've hit 1 full year of link summoning, then I'll make another analysis video. But for now, I just kind of wanted to talk about this sort of unknown decks, or maybe unknown to most, that actually ended up getting hit by link summoning, because people have not really talked about them, or at least that I've seen. But yeah, anyway, I'll see you guys later. Bye.